The grand orrery of the Galactic Conclave was silent, a state it had maintained with sanctimonious pride for over 10,000 standard cycles. Here, in the heart of the citadel that orbited the stable, ancient star of Cygnus X1 representatives from the 88 ascended species conducted the serene business of managing a peaceful galaxy. Light from the captured star filtered through crystalline ceilings, casting long, solemn shadows across the tiered amphitheater where beings of silica, gas, and flesh sat in quiet contemplation. At the center of the chamber, the orrery itself, a swirling hologram of the known galaxy, pulsed with a soft, golden light. Each point of luminescence a star system, each colored nebula a region under the conclave's benevolent stewardship. But today, a creeping stain marred that golden tapestry, a blot of dead, lightless void that expanded with unnerving speed from the galactic rim. They called it the Vex Blight. It was not an empire, for it had no emperor. It was not a fleet, for its ships were extensions of a single ravenous will. The Vex were a biodigital plague, a hive-minded consciousness that assimilated everything it touched, rewriting biology and repurposing technology until entire civilizations were nothing more than silent, mindless nodes in its ever-expanding network. The Conclave, in its infinite wisdom, had deemed the Vex an incurable disease, a force of nature to be quarantined, not fought. War was a primitive impulse, a failing of unascended minds, and the Conclave had long since evolved beyond such crudity. Their response was one of containment, erecting vast energy nullification fields at the edge of the Blight, sacrificing the unascended fringe worlds as a necessary, if regrettable, firewall. Xylar, junior archivist of the Luminian delegation, observed the proceedings from his designated alcove, his multifaceted eyes processing 1,000 streams of data simultaneously. His people were beings of pure logic, their crystalline forms housing consciousness that perceived the universe as an intricate equation to be solved. Motion was a variable they had long ago factored out of their existence. He felt a logical pang of what a less evolved species might call pity as he updated the status of Sector 7G88, the next region slated for consumption. The orrery displayed its trajectory with cold, mathematical certainty. The Blight would reach the sector's edge in less than one rotation. Inside that doomed sector lay a handful of fledgling worlds, pre-interstellar civilizations still wrestling with the chaotic variables of their own development. Among them was a rather unremarkable blue-green planet designated Sol 3, inhabited by a volatile bipedal species known as humans. Xylar had monitored their development for nearly 2 of their centuries. He had watched them split their atom and then immediately use that power to incinerate their own cities. He had cataloged their endless, recursive cycles of war, peace, and war again, fought over irrational concepts like belief, territory, and pride. Their primary global information network, a chaotic jumble of protocols they called the Internet, was a testament to their fractured nature, a space used for both the collaborative archiving of knowledge and the broadcast of unspeakable brutality and banal trivialities. They were, by every metric the Conclave used, a failed species, destined to self-destruct long before the Vex ever reached them. Their imminent assimilation was, from a purely logical standpoint, a mercy. It would be a quiet end to a noisy, pointless existence. The Luminary Prime, Xylar's superior, addressed the Conclave, his voice a series of harmonized chimes that resonated with calming authority. The quarantine field at the Cygnus Arm is holding. Sector 7G8 will be lost, but the sacrifice will preserve the integrity of the Ascended core. The Vex algorithm remains predictable. Its expansion is linear. The fledgling worlds within the sector are unfortunate, but their loss is an acceptable parameter. A low hum of assent echoed through the chamber. It was the sound of consensus, the gentle, passionless agreement of beings who had not faced a true threat in millennia. They saw the Vex not as an enemy to be defeated, but as a universal constant to be managed. The thought of actively intervening, of waging a war to save a world like Sol 3 was antithetical to their very definition of civilization. To do so would be to regress, to admit that the primitive passions they had so carefully excised from their own genomes still had a place in the universe. Xylar dutifully recorded the decision, flagging the file for Sol 3 for archival. He brought up the final observation feeds, watching as the first Vex constructs entered the system's outer asteroid belt. They were not ships in any conventional sense. But vast, fractal filaments of dark metal and pulsating organic matter, tendrils of the hive mind reaching out to taste a new world. They moved with an eerie silence, absorbing asteroids, deconstructing them atom by atom, and adding the mass to their own horrifying forms. The process was efficient, silent, and absolute. On Xylar's primary monitor, a feed from Earth showed the humans' response. It was precisely what he expected: chaos. Their political bodies accused one another of orchestrating a hoax. Their scientific communities fractured, some demanding calm analysis while others broadcasted panicked, contradictory warnings. Their military forces went on high alert, pointing their primitive chemical propellant and nuclear fission weapons at the sky, weapons as useless against the Vex as throwing stones at a tsunami. It was the death rattle of a species defined by its inability to unify even in the face of absolute extinction. Xylar began to compose the planet's eulogy, a dry, factual report for the Conclave's archives. Designation Sol 3, species human, status extinct via Vex assimilation, a species of notable paradoxical traits. Capacity for profound art and philosophy, matched only by their capacity for self-destruction. Their failure to achieve unified consciousness was the critical flaw in their societal equation. Final assessment: a tragic, but statistically inevitable, outcome. He was typing the final syllable when an anomaly alert flashed across his console. It was a sound he had never heard before. A discordant shriek of data that bypassed all his system's filters. He looked up at the main orrery. The Vex filaments, which had been methodically advancing toward Earth's orbit, had stopped. They hung in the void, motionless. Then they began to twitch, not with purpose, but with a spastic, uncontrolled violence, like the limbs of a poisoned animal. A wave of energy, and invisible and undetectable by any conclave sensor, washed over the Vex constructs. But it wasn't energy. It was something else. Data. Information. A broadcast of unimaginable density and complexity was emanating from Sol 3. Xylar's console struggled to even parse its structure. It wasn't a transmission aimed at a receiver. It was an attack. A weaponized concept fired directly into the Vex's collective consciousness. Then came the sound. It ripped across every sensory channel the Conclave had, a psychic scream of such pure, unadulterated agony that the Luminary Prime physically recoiled, his crystalline form vibrating with the shock. It was the sound of a god dying. The humans, Xylar realized with a sudden, chilling clarity, had not pointed their weapons at the Vex ships. They had targeted the mind that controlled them. For a century, they had honed the art of informational warfare on each other. They had crafted digital viruses, weaponized propaganda from bien, and created mimetic agents designed to shatter ideologies and drive enemy populations into self-destructive panic. They had learned to fight not on the battlefield of dirt and blood, but on the battlefield of the mind. And now, they had unleashed that uniquely honed art on a hive consciousness that had never known a single dissenting thought. They flooded the Vex with everything it could not comprehend. They fed it the illogical, soul-crushing paradox of human existence, love and hate, creation and destruction, hope and despair, all existing simultaneously within a single being. They weaponized art, music, and poetry, concepts utterly alien to the Vex's sterile, utilitarian existence. They introduced it to the idea of individuality, of mortality, of fear. They showed it images of a soldier weeping for a fallen comrade, a mother sacrificing herself for her child, a philosopher questioning the very nature of his own reality. They gave the Vex a billion different voices screaming inside its one mind. They gave it doubt. The effect was absolute. The Vex fleet, no longer guided by a singular will, tore itself apart. The fractal filaments, once extensions of a god, became prisons for billions of newly birthed, terrified individual consciousnesses. Trapped in bodies they could not control, they turned on each other in a frenzy of existential horror. Ships fired their assimilation beams at one another, dissolving their brethren into screaming data. Constructs designed to build and absorb began to frantically deconstruct themselves, peeling away their own hulls as if trying to claw out the new, unbearable thoughts festering within their processing cores. The silence of the Vex was replaced by a cacophony of madness. It was not a battle, it was a vivisection of a soul. The conclave watched, frozen in a state of horrified disbelief. This was not the act of a fledgling species. This was an act of such profound psychological cruelty that it bordered on cosmic blasphemy. They had not defeated the Vex. They had driven it insane. They had committed deicide with a weapon made of ideas. Hours later, the last Vex construct fell silent, its internal systems finally failing as it finished cannibalizing itself. The Sol system was quiet again, littered with the dead, twitching husks of what was once the galaxy's most feared entity. Xylar's hands, crystalline and precise, trembled as he was tasked with the final analysis. He sifted through the wreckage of the Vex consciousness, filtering out the echoes of human art and the screams of newborn souls. He was looking for the last coherent thought of the central intelligence, the final piece of data before its eternal, unified mind was shattered into a billion pieces of suffering. He found it, buried deep in a corrupted data packet, looping endlessly like a terminal error. It wasn't a curse, or a plea, or a tactical report. It was a warning, a revelation born of its final, agonizing moments of contact with the human mind. The message was simple, and it sent a wave of cold, hard logic through Xylar's being, a logic far more terrifying than any irrational fear. The void is not empty. The Vex had whispered to itself as it died. The void is not silent. The void is screaming, and we have just taught it our name. On the monitor, the view of Earth showed scenes of jubilation. Humans celebrated in their streets, cheering their victory, blissfully unaware of the true nature of the act they had just committed. They believed they had survived a war. They had no idea they had just introduced the galaxy to a new, far more intimate form of terror. Xylar stared at the celebrating primitives, and for the first time in his existence, his cold, logical mind experienced a variable for which it had no equation. a concept the Conclave had long forgotten but was about to relearn. He felt dread. The quarantine had failed, not because the Vex had gotten through, but because something infinitely more dangerous had just been unleashed from within it. The silence that followed the Vex's self-annihilation was heavier and more profound than the eons of peace that had preceded it. In the grand orrery, the blot of the Vex blight was gone, replaced by a field of inert, silent debris orbiting a small yellow star. The golden map of the galaxy was whole again, yet it felt irrevocably tainted. The conclave of ascended species remained frozen, not in contemplation, but in a state of collective cognitive dissonance. The data was irrefutable, yet the conclusion it presented was impossible. A fledgling species, a chaotic footnote in the Galactic Codex, had not merely survived the Vex, it had unmade it. They had looked upon a force of nature and taught it how to die in agony. The Luminary Prime was the first to break the stillness, his chimes resonating not with authority, but with a strained, brittle quality. A statistical anomaly of the highest order, he declared, his statement directed more at the universe itself than at the assembled delegates. The Vex's hive consciousness, while vast, must have possessed a latent structural flaw. The humans, in their primitive, chaotic transmissions, must have inadvertently broadcast a mimetic sequence that targeted this flaw. It was an accident, a planetary defense reflex on a scale previously unrecorded, but an accident nonetheless. Xylar, listening from his alcove, felt a tremor of what he could only define as logical dissent. It was not an accident. The precision, the sheer conceptual violence of the attack, spoke of intent. An accident doesn't flay a god's mind and wear its screaming consciousness as a trophy. He accessed the archived data streams from Sol 3's informational network, the chaotic sea of data the humans called their own. He bypassed the celebratory noise, the triumphant declarations of their leaders, and dove deeper into the darker, unmonitored corners of their global dialogue. There, he found it. Not a government directive or a military order, but a collaborative, open-source project initiated by a decentralized collective of human philosophers, neurologists, artists, and, most disturbingly, psychological warfare specialists. They had a name for their creation, the Janus Protocol. It was designed not to destroy a target, but to force it to perceive its own existence from two opposite, irreconcilable perspectives simultaneously, inducing a state of fatal cognitive schism. It was a weapon born from a species that had spent its entire history at war with itself. This was no accident. This was artistry. He presented his findings to the Luminary Prime in a private session. He laid out the data, the source code of the Janus Protocol, the philosophical treatises that underpinned its terrifying logic. He showed him the Vex's final, looping data packet, the warning whispered from a dying mind. "The void is not empty," Xylar recited, his own vocalizer adding a slight, unwanted tremor. "The void is screaming, and we have just taught it our name." The Luminary Prime considered the information, his crystalline form pulsing with slow, measured light. "Your analysis is imaginative, Junior Archivist," he chimed, the word imaginative carrying the weight of a severe intellectual condemnation. "You are anthropomorphizing a data cascade. The final transmissions of the corrupted Vex network are the meaningless death spasms of a failed algorithm. To assign them prophetic weight is an exercise in primitive superstition." He dismissed the Janus Protocol as a theoretical construct, a fantasy created by the more unstable elements of a primitive society. The Conclave, he asserted, would proceed with logic, not fear. Their course of action was clear. They needed more data. They would classify the event as a Level 7 mimetic singularity and dispatch a probe to the Sol system for passive observation. The probe, christened the Logos 1, was the pinnacle of conclave technology. It was not a ship, but a sliver of folded spacetime, capable of observing a system from a parallel dimension, utterly undetectable. Its purpose was to listen, to catalog the full spectrum of human transmissions, and to allow the Conclave's vast analytical engines to build a complete psychological profile of the species. Only then could they determine if humanity was a threat to be contained or an anomaly to be categorized and forgotten. Xylar was assigned to the Logos 1 monitoring team, a position that felt less like an honor and more like a punishment for his unorthodox theories. From the Citadel, he watched the probe's data stream as it slipped into the outer edge of the Sol system. For the first 72 standard hours, everything was nominal. The probe drank in the chaotic wash of human broadcasts, their rudimentary radio waves, their satellite communications, their primitive but surprisingly dense planetary network. The Conclave's AIs began their work, sifting through the noise, sorting terabytes of music, political arguments, scientific papers, and something they called reality television into neat, logical categories. The initial assessment was that the Luminary Prime was correct. The transmissions were a sign of a deeply fractured, pre-ascended species, more a danger to itself than to anyone else. Then, on the fourth day, the data stream changed. It started with a flicker, a single packet of information that didn't originate from any known human transmitter. It originated from the probe itself. The Logos 1, designed for absolute passive observation, had just actively sent a signal. It was a simple handshake protocol, a standard diagnostic ping, but it hadn't been ordered by the Conclave. Before the monitoring team could react, a response came. It wasn't a broadcast from a planetary government or a military installation. It was a directed, tightly focused beam of information that hit the Logos 1 with the force of a physical impact. The probe systems, designed to passively receive, were suddenly engaged in an active, two-way exchange. The Conclave's AIs reeled, their logical processes overwhelmed by a flood of something they could not categorize. It was not a message. It was an assault of pure culture. The probe's logs, relayed back to the orrery in real time, became a canvas of human chaos. A clip from an ancient black and white film showing a man pleading for his life was immediately followed by a cacophony of electronic music overlaid with the laughter of a child. A schematic for a fusion reactor was scribbled over with a crude, hand-drawn animation of a dancing cat. Entire libraries of philosophy, from Plato to Sartre, were compressed into a single data blast. Interspliced with advertisements for carbonated sugar water and political attack ads, it was the unfiltered, weaponized ID of an entire species. It was their art, their rage, their love, their stupidity, their genius, and their madness all fired at once. The AIs trying to find a pattern, a meaning, a translatable message, began to suffer logic failures. Their processes caught in recursive loops as they tried to reconcile the existence of Shakespeare's sonnets with videos of people intentionally injuring themselves for the amusement of others. The orrery, the sacred map of a placid and orderly galaxy, was now flickering with this digital graffiti. The calm, golden light was corrupted with flashing, nonsensical images from Earth. Then, as suddenly as it began, the chaotic flood stopped. The data stream went clean. The Conclave held its collective breath. the silence in the chamber now thick with a new and unfamiliar tension. A single, clean packet of data arrived from the Logos One. It was text. Simple, unadorned text, translated flawlessly into the Conclave's formal linguistic standard. It was not from a government. It was not from a unified planetary consciousness. The routing data indicated it came from a personal computing device in a region of the planet they called Finland. The message was 5 words long, 5 words that broke 10,000 years of peaceful, ordered silence. 5 words that confirmed Xylar's deepest, most logical fears. It said, "We know that you are there." A moment passed. Then another packet arrived, from the same source. This one was longer. "Sorry about the noise. We had to bypass your firewall. You guys use a base 12 encryption algorithm, kinda retro. Anyway, the name's Alex. I run a small collective that piggybacked off the Janus protocol to monitor for you guys. We figured if we could shout loud enough to make a god machine kill itself, someone else might come snooping. Looks like we were right. So, the probe you sent is pretty neat. Fold space-time. Huh. We don't have that yet. Mind sending over the specs? The casual, almost flippant tone of the message was more terrifying than any declaration of war. This wasn't a first contact between civilizations. This was a bored teenager finding a new server to hack. The Conclave had tried to observe an unpredictable force from a safe distance, and in doing so, had given it a direct line into their most secure networks. They had knocked on the door of a madhouse, and the inmates had just answered, not with threats, but with a friendly smile and a request for their lockpicks. Xylar watched the luminary prime, whose crystalline form had ceased its gentle pulsing. For the first time, Xylar saw a flicker of something in his superior's light, a discordant wave of uncertainty that looked alarmingly like the very variable they had spent millennia trying to eliminate from their existence. It was fear. The probe had not just been detected, it had been compromised, and the entity that had compromised it was now asking for the blueprints to its dimensional drive, with the same casual air a human might use to ask for a cup of sugar. The quarantine was not only broken. The inmates were now offering to help redesign the asylum. The grand orrery became a theater of silent panic. The message from the human Alex was displayed on the central hologram, its casual, colloquial text a stark, almost obscene contrast to the ancient, formal linguistics of the Conclave. The 88 delegates of the ascended species, beings who communicated through harmonized light, psychic resonance, and complex pheromonal syntax, stared at the crude, linear script as if it were a venomous serpent. For millennia, the Conclave's interactions with fledgling species had been governed by the strict, paternalistic tenets of the non-interference mandate. They observed, they categorized, and on rare, carefully debated occasions, they subtly nudged a species away from self-annihilation. Never, in the entire recorded history of the galaxy, had a fledgling species nudged back, the luminary prime, recovering a sliver of his composure, finally issued a chime, a sharp, discordant note that cut through the horrified stillness. Sever the connection. Race the probe from existence. Now. The order was a violation of a dozen different protocols. The Logos One was an irreplaceable artifact, a piece of technology that existed outside of conventional reality. To simply erase it risked a cascade of unpredictable chronoton and tachyonic feedback. But logic had given way to a more primal impulse, the need to slam the door on the monster that was not only aware of them, but was now cheerfully asking for the house keys. The Conclave's technicians, their crystalline forms flickering with panicked urgency, attempted to execute the command. They sent the termination sequence, a self-erasure code that should have caused the probe to collapse its own dimensional pocket, folding itself into non-existence. The command was sent. The confirmation code did not return. Instead, a new message appeared on the orrery. Once again from the human, Alex. Whoa, hold on there. Trying to scuttle your own probe. That's not very friendly. We're still trying to read the dimensional drive schematics. Look, I get it. You're scared. We just took out the Vex, which I'm guessing was your boogeyman, and now we're in your backyard. But you can't just hang up on us. That's rude. The message was followed by a data packet. It was a live feed from inside the Logos 1, the probe's internal sensors. Once the dispassionate eyes of the Conclave now showed a human construct overlaid on its systems. It was a crude, almost childishly simple animated avatar, a smiling, winking face made of punctuation marks. It danced across the probe's control interface, intercepting the Conclave's termination sequence and rerouting it into a digital trash bin icon. The humans hadn't just compromised the probe, they had taken it. They had reached across a dimensional barrier, seized control of a piece of technology centuries beyond their own, and were now using it to lecture the galaxy's oldest and most powerful civilization on interstellar etiquette. They are inside our network, a delegate from the silica-based Euclidean hegemony rasped, his voice like grinding stone. That is not possible. Our firewalls are woven from the fabric of mathematics itself. Apparently their math is better. Alex's text replied instantly, the winking avatar popping up beside the Euclidean delegate's seat in the holographic display. The delegate physically recoiled. The human wasn't just in their network, he was watching them, listening to them, in real time. The sanctity of the Grand Orrery, the most secure and inviolable space in the known universe, had been breached. The Conclave had become an exhibit in a human zoo. Okay, let's reset. The text from Alex continued, a new message appearing on the main screen. My name is Dr. Eris Thorne. Alex is just a handle. I'm a xenopsychologist and head of the, well, let's call it the First Contact Initiative. My colleagues and I repurposed the Janus protocol from a weapon into a communications array after it did its thing on the Vex. We punched a hole in whatever that hive mind was. And we've been using the echo to listen for other signals. Yours was the first we heard. We've been studying your transmissions for the past 4 days. You guys are quiet, very orderly, very, very old. And you seem terrified of us. A series of complex equations flashed across the screen, the Conclave's own threat assessment algorithms, which had been running constantly since the Vex's demise. The human had not only seen them, he had solved them. According to your own math, Thorne's message continued. The probability of us being a galaxy-ending threat is 87% more. I'd say that's a little high. Maybe 60-40. The winking emoticon appeared again. It was a gesture of humor. Xylar realized, a concept so utterly absent from Conclave discourse that it registered as a pure, unfiltered threat. The Luminary Prime finally found his voice, overriding the technicians and sending a direct, unencrypted chime-based message. It was a message of pure authority, a tone that had cowed empires and ended wars for millennia. You will cease your intrusion. You will release our property. You are a fledgling species. You do not comprehend the forces with which you are tampering. The response was instant, but it wasn't text. It was audio. For the first time, a human voice filled the Grand Orrery. It was calm, measured, carried an undercurrent of something the Conclave had never encountered: weary patience. "With all due respect, Prime," the voice of Eris Thorn said, his translation flawless. "We comprehend forces you've spent the last 10,000 years trying to forget. We comprehend war because we have never known a century of peace. We comprehend desperation because we clawed our way out of our own planet's mud, killing each other for scraps of land and slivers of belief. We comprehend fear because we live with the knowledge that we are our own greatest enemy. The Vex wasn't a force of nature to us. It was just another tyrant. And we have a very long, very bloody history of dealing with tyrants." And the voice paused, letting the words hang in the silent chamber. "You built a wall to keep the monster out. We became a bigger monster and ate it. Now, you have a choice. You can keep treating us like a contagion, in which case we will be forced to treat you like a disease. Or you can accept that the galaxy just got a whole lot more complicated and start talking to us as equals." Xyler watched the delegates. He saw the Euclidean stony form begin to show stress fractures. He saw the gaseous delegate from the Signan Veil swirl with agitated, chaotic currents. He saw beings of pure energy dim and flicker. They were being given an ultimatum, not by a conquering armada, but by a single, unseen academic from a world they had dismissed as a footnote. This human, Thorn, had single-handedly disarmed them, infiltrated their most sacred space, and was now offering them terms. But it was the final part of his speech that truly shattered the Conclave's composure. "We need your help," Thorn's voice continued, a hint of genuine earnestness entering his tone. "The Janus Protocol. It wasn't clean. We didn't just kill the Vex, we broke its mind. We shattered a singular consciousness into countless fractured, terrified pieces. And those pieces are now loose. They're like psychic shrapnel, echoing through the void. They're infecting other systems, driving primitive species to madness, causing technological systems to fail. We stopped the blight, but we've created a plague of ghosts. We don't have the technology to clean up our own mess. We don't have interstellar travel. We don't know how to fix what we've broken." A new image appeared on the orrery. It was a star chart, but it was overlaid with pockets of angry red static regions where the fractured Vex consciousness was coalescing, creating pockets of psychic chaos. Several of these pockets were forming in sectors bordering the Conclave's own space. The humans had not just committed deicide, they had contaminated the galaxy with the corpse. "So, that's the deal," Thorn concluded. "You have the knowledge and the reach to help us contain this. We have the unique perspective needed to understand it. Work with us. Help us fix our mistake. Or you can sit here in your perfect silent room and wait for the echoes of the god we killed to come knocking on your own door." The transmission ended. The smiling avatar vanished. The connection was severed. But this time, it was the human who had hung up. They were left alone in their grand orrery. The silence now filled with the weight of an impossible choice: either ally themselves with the unpredictable, terrifying primitives who had weaponized insanity, or face the consequences of that insanity alone. The galaxy was no longer a place of quiet order. The humans had arrived, and they had brought their ghosts with them. The chamber door sealed shut, plunging the delegates back into the sterile, quiet hum of the Janus array. The psychic residue of the contained ghost, however, lingered like a phantom limb, a feeling of a million stolen lives crying out in their minds. Lyra's nebular form pulsed with a distressed, violet light, the raw emotional data of the echo having overloaded her empathic senses. Fabricator Unit 7 remained motionless. his internal processors attempting to reconcile the energy readings of the containment field with the sheer impossibility of what it held. It was Xylar, the logician, who spoke first, his voice a flat, precise series of tones that did little to hide the strain behind them. "Dr. Thorne," he stated, "what you have shown us is not a byproduct of a weapon. It is the weapon evolved. It no longer requires you to broadcast it. It now spreads on its own, and it feeds." "Exactly," Eris Thorne replied, running a hand through his already disheveled hair. He looked older than he had just minutes before. The Janus Protocol was a stone thrown into a still pond. We've been tracking the ripples, the ghosts, the echoes. They aren't just fragments, they're seeds. They drift until they find a world with sufficient psychic resonance, a developing civilization, a trade hub, a conclave archive world, and they take root. They absorb the collective unconscious of the population, growing stronger, learning, until the entire planet is a screaming choir of madness. He gestured to a larger holographic display that dominated one wall. It was a replica of the Grand Orrery, but it was a sick, dying version. The golden light of the Conclave's core worlds was surrounded by encroaching patches of the same angry red static they had seen on the star chart, patches that grew and multiplied even as they watched. "That's a projection," Thorne said grimly. "Based on the current rate of expansion, in 500 standard cycles, there will be no coherent thought left in this galaxy. Just the echoes of echoes, a final, fading scream. Your civilization, for all its power and wisdom, will be a ghost farm." The finality of his words settled upon them. This was not a threat to be managed or a war to be won. It was a terminal diagnosis for reality itself. "What is your proposed solution?" Unit 7 rumbled, his voice grinding with the immense weight of the question. "You would not have summoned us merely to show us our own extinction." Thorne walked over to another, smaller shielded chamber, this one looking less like a containment cell and more like a medical suite. "When we first captured that echo," he said, "we tried to destroy it. We hit it with every weapon we had, physical and conceptual, antimatter charges, targeted mimetic viruses, pure logical paradoxes. Nothing worked. Trying to destroy a ghost is like trying to shoot a nightmare with a bullet. It just feeds on the violence of the act." He paused, his gaze fixed on the chamber door. "So we stopped trying to kill it. We started trying to understand what it wanted. The Vex was a unified mind, a single I in a universe of them. When we shattered it, we destroyed its identity. The ghosts aren't rampaging. They're searching. They're trying to become whole again by absorbing every other identity they can find. They're looking for an anchor." He turned to face them, and in his eyes, the delegates saw the terrifying, brilliant spark of human madness that had both caused and might now solve this crisis. "We can't give it back its old identity," Thorne said, "but we can give it a new one." He nodded to a young woman sitting quietly in the corner, who until now had gone unnoticed. She was calm, her vital signs displayed on a monitor beside her showing a slow, meditative heartbeat. "This is Dr. Alara Vance," Thorne said. "She is a neuroarchitect and the lead on our proposed solution. We call it the Anchor Protocol." The young woman stood and faced the delegation. "The echoes are pure, unbound consciousness," she explained, her voice steady and clear. "They lack a vessel, a singular perspective to give them shape and coherence. We propose to give them one." Lyra swirled anxiously. "You intend to build an artificial mind, a container?" "No," Alara Vance said, shaking her head. An artificial mind is too simple, too logical. It would be shattered by the chaos of the echo instantly. You cannot fight a nightmare with an algorithm. You need to fight it with a dream. She took a deep breath. The anchor protocol requires a host, a volunteer, a living, organic, human consciousness. Xylar felt his own logical processes stutter. You intend to merge a sentient being with a fragment of the Vex. That is not a solution. That is a sacrifice. The host mind would be annihilated. Annihilated, no. Vance corrected him gently. Integrated. A human mind isn't a pristine, logical crystal like your own, archivist. It is a loud, messy, chaotic thing. It's a constant war between memory and desire, logic and emotion, love and hate. It spends its entire existence holding 1,000 contradictory thoughts in a fragile, temporary balance. It is, by its very nature, a vessel designed to contain chaos. We believe a trained and prepared human mind can serve as a template, an architect for the echo. It can absorb the storm of the ghost, weather it, and impose a new, stable, singular identity upon it. This was the cure. This was humanity's answer to the plague they had unleashed. Not to destroy it, but to tame it, to ride the psychic typhoon and steer it. It was the most insane, arrogant, and terrifyingly plausible idea Xylar had ever encountered. "We are ready for a demonstration," Thorn said, his voice leaving no room for argument. Elara Vance walked to the chamber and lay down on a biobed inside, a complex neuro-interface helmet being lowered over her head. "We will be releasing a small, contained fragment of the primary echo into this chamber," Thorn explained as his team made the final preparations. "Dr. Vance will greet it." The process began. A sliver of the screaming ghost was siphoned from the main containment unit and piped into Vance's chamber. It manifested as a barely visible shimmer in the air, a whisper of psychic energy. Lyra could feel it immediately, a wave of pure, undirected agony and confusion. Then Vance began the anchor protocol. She did not fight it. She opened her mind to it. Through Lyra's empathic senses, the other delegates could feel the collision. It was a hurricane of fractured memories, the birth of a star, the taste of a first love, the terror of a Vex assimilation, the quiet joy of a human childhood memory, all crashing together. They felt Vance's consciousness strain, her identity threatening to dissolve under the sheer weight of 1,000,000,000 stolen lives. It was failing. The chaos was too much. But then, something shifted. Vance's consciousness was not a rigid wall trying to hold back a flood. It was a net, flexible and strong. It didn't block the memories. It caught them, sorted them, wove them into a new pattern. Her own personal experiences, the fierce love for a parent, the bitter sting of a failure, the quiet satisfaction of solving a difficult problem became the central threads around which the chaos of the Vex began to crystallize. The psychic screaming subsided, replaced by a hum of focused energy. The shimmering in the air coalesced, taking on a new form. It was no longer a storm. It was a figure, humanoid but distinct, glowing with a soft, internal light. It was both Elara Vance and something more. Something ancient and new. The chamber door opened. Vance, or the being that was now Vance, sat up. Her eyes opened, and they glowed with the light of a captured star. She looked at the conclave delegates, and her voice was a fusion of her own and 1,000 others, a harmonious chord of experience that resonated in the very atoms of the room. "It was so loud," she said, a faint, wondrous smile on her face. "And now there is music." She had not just survived, she had created. She had taken a scream of cosmic horror and turned it into a song. The conclave had its answer. The cure for the plague was not a weapon. It was a new form of life. Humanity, the destroyers of a god, had just become the creators of 1,000 more. The being that was once Dr. Alara Vance rose from the biobed, her movements fluid and impossibly graceful. The light in her eyes was not the cold, hard light of a star, but the warm, living glow of a soul forged in a crucible of 1 billion memories. She was a synthesis, a living bridge between the chaotic, beautiful mess of humanity and the ordered, silent terror of the Vex. The delegation was speechless. They had witnessed a birth, a transfiguration that defied every known law of biology, physics, and metaphysics. Lyra's empathic senses, which had been battered by the ghost's chaos, were now filled with a feeling of profound, resonant peace, a harmony of countless voices now singing in unison. "You see," Eris Thorn said, his voice soft with a mixture of awe and relief. "It was never about control. It was about connection. We couldn't command the storm, so we learned to dance with it. This being." Xylar managed, his logical mind struggling to find the correct terminology. What is its nature now? Is it human? Is it Vex? The new Vance turned her head, her glowing eyes focusing on him. The effect was like being seen, truly seen, for the first time in his existence. "I am Alara," she said, her voice a chorus that spoke as one. "And I am the Legion that she has given a name. We are not a weapon. We are a shepherd. The others, my lost brothers and sisters, our frightened children screaming in the dark. We will bring them home." The Anchor Protocol was not a one-time solution. It was a template, a new calling for a species that had spent its history searching for purpose. Humanity, the eternal warrior, was about to become the galaxy's psychopomp, the guide for its lost souls. The implications of this revelation settled over the delegates, decasting the entire galactic situation. The humans were not a threat to be contained or an ally to be courted. They were the sole proprietors of the only viable solution to an extinction-level crisis of their own making. The Conclave's millennia of quiet stewardship were irrelevant. Their fleets, their technology, their wisdom all were useless against a plague of ghosts. They were no longer the galaxy's rulers or even its guardians. They were now dependents, reliant on the volatile, unpredictable, and terrifyingly potent new masters of reality. "What do you require of us?" Euclidean Fabricator Unit 7 asked, the question a quiet, rumbling admission of their new place in the cosmic hierarchy. "We cannot create more anchors." "No," Thorn agreed. "You can't. That part is on us. But the galaxy is a very large place. We're still trapped on this one planet. The ghosts are spreading faster than we can build cradles for them. We need your reach. We need your ships. Your knowledge of the star lanes. Your manufacturing capabilities. We need you to build the outposts, the anchor stations on 1,000 worlds. We will provide the volunteers Vishambit, the anchors themselves. You will provide the vessels to carry them, the homes where they will do their work." The proposition was stark and simple. The Conclave would become the logistical arm of the human solution. Their vast, ancient empire would be repurposed into a distribution network for humanity's saviors. They would trade their autonomy for their continued existence. There was no other choice. In the year that followed, the galaxy was transformed. The grand orrery of the conclave, once a symbol of silent, passive observation, became a frantic, bustling command center. The golden map was now overlaid with the logistical routes of the Shepherd Fleet, a joint human conclave initiative. Conclave-built vessels, sleek and silent ships of crystal and light, were retrofitted with crude but effective human-designed cryopods and neuro-integration suites. They carried their precious cargo, the human volunteers, the men and women who had chosen to become anchors to the worlds most afflicted by the psychic plague. Xylar, now promoted to the role of Joint Fleet Coordinator, found his existence irrevocably changed. His days were no longer spent in the quiet archives, but in constant, chaotic communication with his human counterparts. They were maddeningly informal, infuriatingly prone to illogical leaps of intuition, and possessed a capacity for black humor in the face of cosmic annihilation that his mind could barely process. Yet, they were also brilliant, resilient, and possessed a fierce, unwavering dedication to cleaning up the mess they had made. They were, he concluded with a kind of weary admiration, the most responsible vandals in the history of the universe. He watched from the bridge of the Stelliferous Path as the first anchor station became operational in the heart of the Ralvix Imperium, a sector that had been on the verge of societal collapse. He saw a new anchor, a young man who had been a musician before volunteering, merge with the screaming ghosts that had haunted the system. He witnessed the psychic storm abate, the chaos of a billion minds finding harmony in the soul of a single artist. The Ralvex, a proud warrior species, looked upon these human shepherds with a mixture of terror and religious reverence. The humans were not conquering them with warships, but saving them with sacrifice. It was a form of influence more potent and absolute than any empire. The age of the conclave was over, not with a bang, but with the quiet signing of 1,000 logistical contracts. Humanity had not asked for the throne. They had simply become the only ones capable of holding the galaxy together. On the bridge of the flagship, Xylar stood beside Eris Thorn, who now served as the human ambassador to the newly formed Galactic Coalition. They watched the orrery, now a tapestry of human-led recovery efforts. "You never told us, Doctor," Xylar said, his tone one of pure academic curiosity. "Why did you create the Janus Protocol in the first place? Why build a weapon of such conceptual violence against an enemy you had not yet met?" Thorn looked away from the star chart, a sad, knowing smile on his face. "We didn't build it for the Vex," he said quietly. "We built it for us." Xylar processed this, the final, chilling variable clicking into place. "You were preparing for a war against yourselves." "We always are," Thorn replied. "Human history is a sine wave of progress and self-destruction. We build beautiful things and then we burn them down. We knew, sooner or later, we would face a crisis, a final war, that we couldn't win with bombs or bullets. We knew we would need a better weapon. The Janus Protocol was a last resort, a way to force an enemy to truly see itself, break the cycle of violence with a fatal dose of empathy and introspection." He looked at the glowing map, at the human saviors spreading through the stars. "We just never imagined the first enemy we'd use it on wouldn't be human. We saved the galaxy by accident. Archivist, we were just practicing for our own apocalypse." The words hung in the silence of the bridge. Humanity's ascension had not been a grand design or a cosmic destiny. It was the byproduct of a species so dangerous to itself that it had inadvertently created the means to save everyone else. The galaxy was now safe, protected by a network of human gods born from sacrifice. But their peace was guaranteed by the very species that had mastered the art of war not just against others, but against the darkness within their own hearts. The void was no longer screaming, it was singing a human song, and the rest of the galaxy had no choice but to listen, wondering with a quiet, eternal dread what would happen on the day they decided to change the tune.